Great. Well, our speaker today is Emily, or M. Gates, and she is a PhD candidate in literary studies at Georgia State University in Atlanta. And she's currently working to complete her dissertation linking high rates of melancholia in colonial New England to the emergence of predominantly melancholic characters in early American literature. And prior to this, she completed her undergraduate work at Berry College in Rome, Georgia, before moving to Canterbury, England, where she graduated with her MA in English and American Literature from the University of Kent. M is a burgeoning early Americanist whose primary research interest is literature and medicine, especially the intersection of literature, trauma, and mental illness. And she also loves multi-ethnic literature of the United States and Southern literature. And you can certainly find her previous work in Literae Mentis, a journal of literary studies, and Panoply, a literary zine. And she is also a fellow with the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium. So Emily was recently here conducting research at the CHS in late spring. So we're really looking forward to hearing about her findings and get a little update on how things are going with her research. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Emily, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jen. Hello to everybody. I see some familiar faces and names, which is very encouraging, especially as a young scholar. And I'm excited to share my work with you today. Just real quick before I start, please, please, please support the Connecticut Historical Society. Having been physically at the CHS, it's a beautiful mansion, used to be a home, and now it's a museum. I really enjoyed my time there. Everybody was so nice to me. So please support them, support their events, because it would mean a lot to me and them as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you all can see my presentation. And if I could just get a thumbs up to make sure it's working, that would be awesome. Got it. Okay, perfect. So, view show. Alrighty. So my dissertation is entitled A Young, Sad Country, Melancholia and Colonial New England and Its Impact on Early American Literature. Of course, as Jen said, I am a PhD candidate over at Georgia State University. I'm currently in my 4th year, and so I have one more year in which I plan to finish my dissertation and hopefully turn it into a book and then go out on the academic job market. So what I like to start with, and this goes for my students, but also the way that I work as a researcher, I love to start with problems or things that I notice. And one thing I tell my students all the time is look for a problem or something you observe or a gap. We call it a gap in the field. If you can fill a gap or answer a question nobody else has answered or point to something, you've kind of hit pay dirt. So these are the problems that I really started with. The first thing is bodily afflictions, especially smallpox, but throat distemper and yellow fever are the primary things that dominate early American discussions of illness. We're really interested in the bodily afflictions, what that says about medical history, religious intervention, and things like that, which is really important. But not a lot of people are talking about mental afflictions, which also existed, and that's a problem. The other thing is, because early America, the Plymouth Rock and sort of the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony happens in 1620. And that's a long period of time between 1620 and then World War II, which is where we find out a lot about mental illness, and even earlier in the 1900s in the Victorian asylum era. There's a long period of time between what we learn about mental illness in a quantifiable capacity versus just kind of a bunch of people having theories. So I am way early in the archives, which presents certain problems, right? The historical record is incomplete. I can only rely on the perspectives that exist. And I have to understand that there are things that have been communicated that come largely from England. So I have to also differentiate between, okay, what's an English theory and what's an American theory? That's another problem. And then lastly, and this is the thing my committee absolutely loves to bring out, is what do I, as a literary scholar, do with the information that I find? Because while I'm getting a doctorate in English literature, what I am not is a medical doctor, and what I am not is a psychologist. I don't have those degrees, and I don't have that expertise, which is okay. But I do have to be very careful about how I present information, how I talk about mental illness, and how I present these things, because I need to stay in my lane, right? I can make contributions, but I have to stay in my lane. I'm a literary scholar, and I have to use that in specific ways to my advantage. So those are the problems that I started with. The other thing that just kind of kept coming into my mind when I was thinking about this project is why are so many early American novels and short stories so sad? If you think about it, when you get to the Victorian era, you have people like Dickens, for example, in England. We have very clear-cut, nice little plot lines where the villains are punished, and people like Oliver Twist get money and a family and everything's good and people are married and everyone's happy, right? We have these clear sort of bad people bad, good people good. In early American literature, though, that's not the case for a long time. A lot of the plot lines are frankly depressing and horrible. People are committing suicide. They are irreparably ruined by some sort of action. And that really stuck out to me. I kept thinking about, why is that? Why is it so sad? And that's the primary things I'm trying to investigate here. So moving into just the overall dissertation, I'm going to give you a project overview. Then we're going to zoom in a little bit more into the specifics of what I'm talking about. And then lastly, I'll share with you a case study where I'm going to ask for some audience input as well. But the primary research questions, which are kind of driving my analysis, are firstly, how did early Americans understand mental illness, and how did they differentiate between types, right? You will maybe be interested to know that there are clear divisions between what separates somebody with melancholia from mania, from general insanity, from something like a nervous fever causing delirium. There are differentiations of types, but there are a wide range of perspectives on the causes and symptoms. The other thing is, how did early American authorities, primarily medical and religious authorities in my realm, help colonists suffering from melancholia? And is the religious approach different from the medical, which we'll explore a little bit later on? And then lastly, which is kind of the driving question, is what was the impact of melancholia as a regional affliction on the creation of an American national literature? So here I'm linking literature and the history of medicine, which is what we call an interdisciplinary dissertation. So I'm keeping in my realm of literature, but I'm also bringing in historical documents, sermons, sometimes poetry, and novels and short stories. And I'm creating a picture to give a better idea of the record of melancholia as it affected people in New England. Primarily, I'm looking at Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and possibly Pennsylvania. And then I'm linking those real life cases to American literature, which I'll talk about in a moment. So a couple of key terms, if they come up in the presentation, this is what I'm talking about. So generally speaking, melancholia is the old term for what we now call depression. Everybody has a different definition of it, and people differentiate between types of melancholia and what is melancholia. So, but basically everybody, the medical authorities primarily agree that it's a nervous or neurological disease, largely characterized by low spirits, lethargy, sadness, excessive crying, things like that. So just general sadness or depression is what I mean by melancholia. We're not working with the Freud term, that's too late for us, but that's what I mean when I say melancholia. And then there are two types that I primarily identify in my dissertation, and all three types that are mentioned there come from Robert Burton. And Robert Burton was a medical student and a religious scholar out of Oxford University in the 17th century. So in 1621, he writes a nonfiction book called The Anatomy of Melancholy, where he basically does a very similar thing that I'm doing, but his purpose was to try and alleviate his own melancholy, because he did suffer from melancholia, as well as help others. So he identifies religious melancholia, love melancholia, and scholarly melancholia as 3 different types. And I primarily work with religious and love. The only difference between these 3 types is their root cause. So religious melancholiacs typically are convinced of their own damnation, or they have committed some irreparable sin that they just, there's no fixing it. They're convinced that God has abandoned them, or they've committed some error and they are forever just damned. That's a very common one, especially for the New England region, which I'm exploring. Then more common in early American literature is love melancholia, which is caused primarily by romantic relationships, either not working out, not getting to marry the person you wanted. And there's some other real life situations that involve love melancholia. And then scholarly, we see a lot less in literature. Later on, Nathaniel Hawthorne writes a novel called Fanshawe, which involves both love and scholarly melancholia. But typically, scholarly melancholia is when, which is funny coming from me, you read too many books, you study too much, you forget to go out and enjoy the fruits of life. So that one does come up less in literature, but that is one of the other types that he mentions. A couple of other key terms. Medical providentialism. I first encountered this term in William Woodward's Prospero's America, which is about John Winthrop Jr. and his role as an alchemist, practicing alchemy in New England. But medical providentialism is a theory where the belief that God or God's will play a central role in who gets sick, who heals from their sickness. And this is especially prevalent in the Puritan culture. People believed that if they or a family member was sick, it's often because they sinned somehow, needed to learn a lesson, something like that. And only through learning that lesson were they able to heal. So that comes up once in a while. When we get to methodology, I will mention New Historicism, which is a 20th century literary theory. And basically what it says, there are many aspects of New Historicism, but the central one here is using a cultural context of a specific time to draw conclusions about literature. So in my case, I am looking at these literary texts as a product of a specific time, namely the 18th century, and also bringing in the cultural context of religious theory, medical theory, available historical documents to construct my analysis. And then also related to my methodology is close reading, which is a lot of what we do in literary scholarship is we use quotes or portions from a text, and we really isolate either, sentences, phrases, even sometimes specific words, putting it in an extreme detail so that we can then draw out those conclusions. All right, on to my methodology. So like I said, I use an interdisciplinary approach combining the literary with the archival and historical, using New Historicism and close reading. So what I'm doing is taking literature that exists, fiction, real historical documents, sermons, sermons, sometimes texts from early asylums, things like that, and combining them so that I can draw conclusions about the cultural context of my argument. And sometimes I isolate specific portions to analyze it in greater detail. It's also framed both by Robert Burton, who I talked about earlier, and also contemporary scholarship, so people who are alive right now who also work in the same field. Their arguments, this is what we call commenting in scholarship. We use other people's work to kind of help bolster our own work, and we cite them to give them credit for that. And then again, like I said, I'm putting these in conversation together to draw conclusions about early American literature, medical history, and specifically American literature between 1700 and 1820. And the key texts, again, I'm very early on in the drafting process. My goal is to get my first chapter turned in January, but the key texts are The Anatomy of Melancholy, which I mentioned. It mainly is the framing device that I use to typify love and religious melancholia. And then these are the three primary works of literature that I'm working with. So we have The Power of Sympathy by William Hill Brown, Charlotte Temple by Susanna Rowson, and then The Minister's Black Veil, which is a short story. And I know you're going to point out, well, you just said that you are talking about literature between 1700 and 1820. So why are you using 1836, a short story from 1836? And the reason for that is I think 1836 is still within the relative time period that I can make an argument that this literature is relevant, right? The same things that are going on with Melancholia and the cultural understanding of it are still happening in 1836. Additionally, it's worth pointing out The Power of Sympathy and The Minister's Black Veil are specifically chosen for this dissertation because they are based on real cases. So William Hill Brown lived in Boston, Massachusetts, and his neighbor was a woman named Fanny Apthorpe. And Fanny Apthorpe had an affair with a man called Perez Morton, who was later the Secretary General of Massachusetts. And they come to find out that they are semi-related, and their affair does result in a child, which of course means it was an incestuous relationship. And that child and that revelation of their familiarity does result in Fanny Apthorpe's suicide. And so William Hill Brown's novel does dramatize that real life case. And so you can see already, just based on that description, there's a clear linkage between a real case of someone with suffering consistent with mental illness and American literature. The same thing with The Minister's Black Veil. There was a minister in Maine by the name of Joseph Moody, and he just starts coming to church with a black veil draped over his face as if he were in mourning or something. And his congregants notice it, and it's very odd and very strange. And he just keeps wearing it for a long period of time. And the Hawthorne story takes some liberties with it, but we at the Massachusetts Historical Society, I was able to read Joseph Moody's diary, and based on his own writings, it's very clear he did suffer from religious melancholia, which is actually very common in clergymen of the time. So I did specifically choose those because they are linked to real life cases. All right, so here's the crux of my argument, which is what we call a thesis. And I'll tell you the pictures. So starting on the left, the woman is Susanna Rowson. It's a drawing of her. Though she was born in England, she did immigrate to the US and stay there for most of her life. So we do lump her novel, Charlotte Temple, which was published in 1794 in American literature. It's one of our early novels. Up top, we have William Hill Brown, who again was the neighbor of Fanny Apthorpe and dramatized that very scandalous affair. And on the right, we have an older Nathaniel Hawthorne out of Salem, Massachusetts. If you do ever have the chance, his house is really cool. And it's right next to the House of the Seven Gables, which is a novel he wrote. So I do recommend going there. So the thesis. The main crux of my argument is that the earliest works of American literature are very dark and sad and feature tragic storylines and specifically melancholic characters because these writers drew inspiration from the world around them. So, I'm arguing that American literature is largely dark in nature. There are melancholic characters, people commit suicide, and this is largely because early American writers draw inspiration from the world around them. Now, it's important to specify the world around them, right? That's a very vague term. So in my argument, I'm arguing that Melancholia was not only existent, but it's a widespread regional affliction that affects so many people, and that could easily be seen whether you're in Boston, Massachusetts, one of the largest cities, or a very small sort of town or settlement. Mental illness was prevalent everywhere. The other thing is when you have large stories like the Fanny Apthorpe Perez Morton affair that I mentioned earlier, these cases caught the attention of the media. And so people are well aware when these scandalous things happen and result in things like suicide or things like that. Okay, moving on. So here's some common language describing mental illness that is current to the period. So on the left side, we have general descriptors, and on the right side, we have specific symptoms of melancholia. I'll just point out a few that come up over and over again. So we see a lot: devoid of reason, that person is distracted. You see maniac or maniacal. People are described as having wild looks in their eye. And then you also have these strange terms where people lump idiocy or being dull or not smart with mental illness. That's more what we would call a developmental issue than anything else. Then you have, going back to the Salem witch trials, hysteria and demonic possession. And then you may be interested to learn that melancholia was also linked to hypochondria. And hypochondria was really just another name for melancholia. It's not, the colloquial term we use today where you're afraid every time you get sick. It meant something very different back then. And then here are some general symptoms of melancholia. Again, low spirits, feeling dejected, lethargy, not wanting to do anything. Specific to religious melancholia, you have being convinced of irreparable sin, being abandoned by God, feeling like you have just sinned the unsinnable sin and there is no help for you whatsoever. Specific to love melancholia, we have excessive pining for somebody or something, excessive crying in general, over or under eating and sleeping. Dyspepsia is described a lot in medical handbooks, which is indigestion or excessive gas. This kind of goes back to Galen and the Four Humors. So there's a medical theory where if you were balanced humorally, you were great. If there was some sort of imbalance, that was thought to cause a certain illness. You also see a lot of anxiety or fear, loss of emotional control, and suicidal ideation. All right, so here are some factors to consider, and people did consider when thinking about treating mental illness. You have your religious belief, your religious affiliation. That might determine whether you sought a medical authority or a clergyman. Where you were located, because the medical hierarchy, the medical networks in the early United States were very different and way less organized than that of their English counterparts. So it may be you had a local medical practitioner come through once a month, and that was all you got, which ties into the availability of clergy or medical practitioners. It also depended on your family and what they were able to do for you and what they thought was best, how severe a case was, whether or not you were able to pay. There were some medical practitioners who forgave debt in instances of extreme poverty, but it really depended on the practitioner. And then what was done and how somebody was treated was based on their level of threat to the community. So like I mentioned earlier, you would often find mentally ill people ambling the streets in small towns, right? They were prevalent everywhere. And if they just walked around and didn't harm anybody, nothing was really done to them. Nobody really bothered them and vice versa. However, if they were well known as a threat to the community, violent in any way, shape, or form, then you might see some of those extreme measures that people talk about, being put in chains or jailed or shoved off to one family member or another to kind of keep them out of sight and prevent anything bad from happening. On the left side, this is actually from the Connecticut Historical Society. This is a page out of Daniel Calkin's medical account book. So this is where he would list the patient, where he saw them, and what they treated them for. And if you're not an expert in 18th century handwriting, that's fine. I can read it for you. So we have Nathaniel Wilson. So he was seen over a series of days, the 24th, 26th, and 27th. So he was treated, he was visited. Anodyne is a painkiller. What really drew me to this in particular is the second and the last entry, which contained the phrases emotional physic. Or excuse me, I think that says emollient, but in other Daniel Calkins mentions emollient physic and emotional physic, which is, as best as I can guess, physically going to somebody's house and caring for them. So common medical treatments, bloodletting was really big. Later on towards the asylum era, you see baths in extreme temperatures being suggested. The Royal College of Physicians out of Edinburgh was big on baths and exercise. You also have some interesting home remedies like drinking water mixed with tar, salts. Local physicians would often have home visits, and in some of these medical account books, you see physicians staying consistently overnight, or the same person coming up again and again and again and taking emotional physic, which is something I find very interesting. Then you have things like pain relievers. Anodyne is mentioned in that example on the left, enemas and emetics, because it was believed that expelling stuff from your body would result in you feeling better. All right, on the left there, we have a quote that's actually from the CHS did a wonderful exhibit on mental illness called Common Experience, Individual Struggle. Jen, correct me if that's the wrong title. And this was a quote from Mary Fishnoise out of New Haven, Connecticut. And on the right, we have common religious approaches. So, you know, there are a lot, especially in pop culture, when mental illness comes up, there's a lot of depiction of dehumanizing practices, right? And what I find actually in the historical record, especially in the religious realm, is a repeated insistence on encouragement and help of the mentally ill, not demonizing them for what they say or what they do, but treating them as human beings and approaching them with patience and kindness. This was particular to Cotton Mather, who was both a very important religious figure, as well as a medical student. And he wrote repeatedly about caring for the mentally ill as opposed to harming them. So common approaches are largely prayer and fasting. Communities would do prayer and fasting together. One of the most interesting things is, I think, the early form of talk therapy that sort of emerges between clergy and afflicted people. So, for example, Thomas Hooker, who is a big figure in Connecticut, especially Hartford, he's buried right downtown in Hartford, made a career out of counseling religious melancholics. There was a woman named Joan Drake who he basically academically debated until she was fixed of her religious melancholia, and that kind of made his career. And then later on, clergy would write about their cases in the form of sermons, either how they counseled somebody out of it, or, you know, in the instances of murders or suicide, that person would be used as an example to teach others. All right, so here's where we have a little bit of time left. I'm going to very quickly go through this. I have a brief case study. So what I'm going to do is show you two examples of actual words. I'm going to pretend and involve you in an exercise. So I'm about to show you two examples. One is from a diary and one is from a poet. And when we're going through these, I want you to keep four things in mind, and you can either jot down some notes or just have it in your brain. But I think this is a good way for us to get into our discussion and Q&A portion. So when I show you these examples, I want you to notice the tone. So what sort of emotions is this person talking about or coming up with? Then I want you to notice the theme. What are some themes or commonalities you can pull out of these examples? Then you're going to focus on language. If any language just strikes you or seems interesting, go ahead and pull that out. And then the last thing is the purpose, right? So one thing we're going to look at is a diary. Another thing we're going to look at is a section of a poem. So think about the differences between those two things. And again, if you want to just jot down some things or just have it in your brain, I'm going to ask you to tell me what are some things you notice in these two examples. All right. So again, if you are not well versed in 18th century handwriting, that is okay. I will read you the significant portions I want you to focus on. So this is another source from the CHS, a man named Benjamin Lyon, who died in his 60s. He was pretty ill for the majority of this diary, which was written towards the end of his life. And we don't know exactly enough about Benjamin Lyon, because when we went back and looked at the historical record, dates were mixed up. And so I can't say for certain what he did, but I do know that he did die in his 60s. So this is one entry from his diary. So Wednesday, June 30th, this day exceeding poorly, cannot perform any duty composedly, filled with distraction, wanderings, coldness, indifference. Lord, look upon me, a poor, helpless, guilty, polluted, unworthy creature. Take away sin from me, reveal Jesus to me, give me faith in him. May I be found doing thy blessed will while I contrive in this world. Lord, let me do and suffer thy blessed will. May I finish my course with joy and then be received to thy blessed self in glory. So that's one example. So again, we're thinking about tone, language, the purpose, given that this is a diary. And I have one more example, which is from the same source. All right, so this is Tuesday, June 25th. Poorly today, I have a pained head, a broken constitution, and my soul dwells in a crazy tabernacle. Lord, sanctify afflictions to me. Oh, for patience, for contentment, for a heart to submit to the will of God in all things, not my will, but thine. Oh, Lord, be done in all things. Still deadness and wanderings in all my duties. Oh, Lord, deliver me from stupidity. All right, so that's the first thing, the first source. And then the second source comes from Edward Taylor. Edward Taylor is another really big name. He was a minister out of Westfield, Massachusetts. And although his poetry was not published until 1937, he has a series called Preparatory Meditations, which were basically poems he wrote in preparation of sermons of Mass. And so I thought it would be an interesting example to compare that with Lyon. So this is just the first and the last stanza, but do the same thing and notice the tone, the language, the purpose. So I'll read it. All dull, my lord, my spirits flat and dead, all water-soaked and sapless to the skin. Oh, screw me up and make my spirits bed, thy quickening virtue, for my ink is dim, my pencil blunt. Doth Joseph type out thee, heralds of angels sing out, bow the knee. And then the last stanza, this I bewail in me under this shine, to see so dull a color in my skin. Lord, lay thy brightsome colors on me thine. Scour thou my pipes, then play thy tunes therein. I will not hang my harp and willows by, while thy sweet praise my tunes doth glorify. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing. So if we could just have some thoughts, what did people notice? What sort of tone, what sort of purpose? What did you notice between the two sources that I just showed? And you can either pop it in the chat or just give us your thoughts.
Feel free to unmute yourself if you like. Molly put in the chat, the first is more despairing.
Yeah, the first is very despairing. We have, he describes his brain as a crazy tabernacle. Some other, I was trying to find some of the more severe ones, but as we get to the end of Benjamin Lyon's life, he talks about himself as a wasting candle, just the time's getting shorter and shorter. He also calls himself a worm, like I'm just so unworthy, I'm a worm. And Edward Taylor actually has poetry where he too calls himself a worm and living in dirt and excrement and just these very, yeah, you're right, these very sad, despairing ways to talk about the self. Other observations?
A word that jumped out at me in Lyon's diary was polluted.
Yeah, polluted. There's a lot of these, Edward Taylor's poetry, some of it is very scatological, dealing with just excrement and these vile descriptions. And same thing with Lyon. I'm a polluted person. My soul is polluted and sinful. And this is where you see the religious melancholia. He's just so convinced, and it's consistent across the entire diary, that he's just wrong and sick and abandoned. And you can see, one thing I'd like to point out is in both instances, they start off very despairing and sad. I am polluted. I'm a crazy tabernacle. I'm a worm. I am this. And then they move towards a feeling of hope or pleading God for help, right? It's, I am this way, but God, show me the way. Show me how to, how to be better. So there is a hopefulness, and that's specifically has been commented on in scholarship in Edward Taylor. He starts with this despairing conceit and then talks about how through God we can all be made better and righted. But yeah. Does the concept of pollution have any, I guess we can move into the Q&A portion now. So I see Marcia asks, does the concept of pollution have any connection to sexuality? It's possible. I think that a lot of times when you find, these descriptions like I'm polluted, I'm wrong, it can be read that way. I don't know enough about Benjamin Lyon because of the record to know his sexuality. I think he did have a wife. Edward Taylor, I want to say there is scholarship speculating about Taylor's sexuality, but off the top of my head, I don't know. But I think the nice thing about literature is we can interpret things if there's enough textual evidence. So if you found a theme across Taylor's poetry, you could easily make that connection. A little bit earlier, Marcia says, I was wondering about reasons why people in New England would be particularly susceptible to melancholia or depression. Any thoughts about a connection to the depressive diagnosis called seasonal affective disorder due to low levels of sunlight for a significant portion of the year? So this is where I can only really rely on the text, right? I'm not qualified to diagnose people. I can only sort of fit them into types and support it with my textual theory. I think especially if you work in trauma theory, you could easily talk about how traumatic the New England experience was, right? You're basically in survival mode. You have to grow your own food. You have to hunt your own food. You have to provide for your family. You're susceptible to Native American attacks. So it was a very difficult way of living. That might have contributed to it some, especially in the earlier colonial years. And then there is a lot of scholarship linking a few prominent women to the American Revolution. So Mary Fish Noyes, who I talked about earlier, and I think Faith Trumbull Huntington. There are some great articles talking about how they were so traumatized by the Revolutionary War experience that I think in Trumbull Huntington's eventually committed suicide because it was too much for her. So yeah, I think there are very valid reasons for why it might have been particular, but in my realm, I'm more interested in it exists, and I'm still working out the reasons why, and I think it's varied.
I know I can't think of her name off the top of my head. I'm drawing a blank. She wrote a book about witchcraft. I think she focused mainly on Salem But she was trying to make a connection in her book about the incidences of hysteria are really sort of a what we would call PTSD, because they come after an attack. So it would be curious to kind of link the timing of certain people, if you're looking at diaries, for example, diaries, and when they're having these episodes with the time of the year or any major event that would have happened recently that could maybe kind of connect to this episode they're having.
Yeah, it's Laura Says Stacy Schiff is the author of that book.
Anybody else have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself if you like, or I can throw it in the chat.
This is Dave. I do have a question. I can't type, I'm sorry. But curious if you thought that the puritanical religious background of that era had any connection to the Melancholia. It was kind of characterized by fire and brimstone perspective that people were terrible sinners, and I wonder if that led to self-condemnation and impacts on their health. Any thoughts about that?
I think especially early on, this is so true, right? Everybody nowadays loves to use the word, oh, don't be such a Puritan, right? Don't close the theaters, don't, be a stick in the mud. And, but I do think that's a really valid theory, right? The Puritans were very emphatic about authority and religious duty, and you do see it creating anxiety, right? I think one of the reasons why a lot of these, even clergymen, but people like Joanna Drake, who I mentioned earlier, a lot of these people who suffered relief about being sinners, about being evil, about being bad, that it feels bad to be bad, right? And when you have a religion that consistently emphasizes, if you don't do this, you're bad. If you're constantly not thinking about God, you're bad. I think that would absolutely contribute to it. And in religious melancholia, I would argue that that's predominantly what we see. They become convinced because of the messages that they're given. So yeah, absolutely. I think the puritanical religion does contribute to it. And this is perhaps why, too, in some of the novels I'm looking at, like novels and short stories, the cultural understanding of having an incestuous relationship was so scandalous and so horrible, and tied into religious mores of the time that, Fanny Apthorpe felt she had no way out other than to commit suicide, right? As well as with Reverend Joseph Moody, although he dies of old age, he felt convinced of his sin. So he physically covered his face. He didn't want people to look at his face. So yeah, I think the thread is definitely there. Religion plays a big deal, is a large factor in how some of these religious melancholiacs felt.
Anybody else? Any comments or questions? Again, feel free to throw it in the chat or unmute. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much, Emily. This was fantastic. I am really looking forward to what your research reveals as you uncover more and get further along in your process here. It's quite a topic, and I think really interesting yet relevant to today as well. And we would love to have you come back when you have a few more chapters under your belt, that would be great. This was really wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I will send the recording to everyone that registered, but certainly the guests that I do see that a few people had to duck out. But thank you for those of you that stuck with us through our little glitch that we had today. You never know what happens with Zoom, for sure. Thank you,
Thank you so
everyone.
much. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to presenting again when I've got more concrete conclusions. So thanks,
Yes,
everybody.
thanks so much. This is wonderful. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye now.